My guest today is Javier Vinos. He is the author of the 2023 book, Solving the Climate Puzzle. And there are some great quotes in the foreword to that book from Will Happer. One is, I know of no other book that presents so many detailed and interesting facts about Earth's climate. Another quote from Will, the most compelling takeaway message is that the maniacal focus on carbon dioxide as the control knob of Earth's climate is a profound delusion. Javier did a write-up on this same stuff in Judith Curry's blog, Climate, Etc. There's a link to that in the show description. And also he has now a YouTube channel. I also put a link to that in the show description.
The sun is a variable star, and the amount of energy it emits varies from month to month, year to year, and century to century. One of the manifestations of these variations are sunspots, which are more common when the sun is more active and disappear when it is less active. These spots follow a solar cycle of about 11 years, but sometimes there is a longer period, decades or centuries, when the sun's activity is so low that there are no spots. These periods are called grand solar minima. There are also periods of decades or centuries when the activity is higher. These are called grand solar maxima. The sun provides 99.9% of the energy that the climate system receives, so there have always been scientists who thought that variations in the sun were the cause of climate change. The problem is that they never had enough evidence to prove it, until now. The IPCC and NASA are convinced that changes in the sun have very little effect on climate. They rely on two arguments. The first is that changes in solar activity are very small. We measure them with satellites because they cannot be measured from the surface, and we know that the radiant energy coming from the sun varies by only 0.1%. The magnitude of the changes is better appreciated when we use the full scale. Many scientists believe that such a small change can only produce small changes in climate. The second argument is that the evolution of temperature does not coincide with the evolution of solar activity. Since the 1990s, solar activity has decreased while warming has continued. Actually, this argument is not valid because it does not say that the sun does not affect temperature, but that it is not the only factor in doing so, something we already knew, because temperature responds to many factors, such as El Niño, volcanoes, the polar vortex, or changes in the Earth's orbit. There are many natural causes that change the climate, and what we need to know is whether the sun is one of the main ones. To find out, we don't need to care what the IPCC and NASA think. We need to ask the climate itself. It doesn't matter how small the changes in the sun are, if it turns out that the climate responds strongly to them by causing big changes. And the best way to find out is to look at what has happened to the climate over the last 11,000 years, the interglacial period we call the Holocene. The advantage of doing this is that the Holocene climate changes could not have been caused by changes in CO2. They must have been caused by something else. To study the climate of the past, scientists use various climate proxies that they collect in different parts of the world. Some of the most commonly used are organic remains of marine phytoplankton, plant pollen, ice cores from polar ice caps, shelled marine microorganisms, lipids of prokaryotes, and remains of invertebrates at the bottom of lakes. A major study published in Science used 73 of these proxies to reconstruct Holocene climate. I have used the same proxies with a slight modification in the way they are mixed. What we see, and what a large number of studies also support, is that there was a warm period of thousands of years called the climate optimum, followed by a long period of cooling called the neoglacial. How do we know that this reconstruction is correct? Another study reconstructed the progress of the Earth's glaciers over the past 11,000 years. They divided the globe into 17 regions, and this graph shows the number of regions whose glaciers increased in size during each century of the Holocene. Since glaciers grow when it is colder, we can invert this figure and compare it to the temperature reconstruction graph so that its meaning is the same. We find a high degree of agreement. The glaciers confirm what the temperature reconstruction shows. We also know that CO2 has done the opposite of temperature. but that is a story for another day. Both graphs also show some severe cooling episodes that were accompanied by increased glacier growth. These abrupt climate events of the past have been studied and identified by paleoclimatologists. Of all of them, we will focus on four of the most important ones: the boreal oscillation, the 5.2 kiloyear event, the 2.8 kiloyear event, and the Little Ice Age. The four are separated by multiples of 2500 years and form a cycle that I have called the Brace cycle because that was the name of the person who discovered it in 1968. I want you to remember this graph because we will come back to it a little later. But now that we know the climate of the past, we need to talk about the activity of the Sun in the past. The Sun's activity is recorded in the three rings through the action of cosmic rays. A constant stream of cosmic rays from the galaxy reaches the solar system. Some interact with the atmosphere. Some collide with nitrogen in the atmosphere, converting it to carbon-14, which is heavier than normal carbon-12 and radioactive. This carbon-14 combines with oxygen to form radioactive CO2, which is breathed by trees. The carbon is used in photosynthesis to make cellulose, which allows the tree trunk to grow in diameter. When the tree dies, the carbon-14 in the wood slowly decays over centuries and millennia. You just have to measure how much carbon-14 is left in the wood to know how much time has passed since the tree died. Each growth ring of a tree records the carbon-14 that was in the atmosphere that year, and scientists have used millennia-old trees and preserved logs to construct a calibration curve that spans tens of thousands of years. This allows them to determine the age of any organic remains, even if it is not a tree trunk, just by knowing the carbon-14 it contains. This is known as radiocarbon dating. The only problem is that the production of carbon-14 by cosmic rays is not constant. The Sun's magnetic field deflects the path of cosmic rays, causing many to miss the Earth, and changes in the Sun's activity affect its magnetic field. As the Sun's activity increases, fewer cosmic rays arrive, less carbon-14 is produced, and organic remains appear older because they contain less of it. When the Sun's activity becomes weaker, more cosmic rays arrive, more carbon-14 is produced, and the organic remains look younger because they contain more of it. This produces deviations in the calibration curve that allows us to know what the Sun's activity was in the past. When we analyze the radiocarbon curve over the last 11,000 years, we observe large deviations that indicate long periods of low solar activity. These extended periods of low solar activity are called grand solar minima and increase carbon-14 production by 2%. The most common ones last about 75 years, and there have been about 20 in the last 11,000 years. The most recent was the Maunder minimum in the late 17th century, but there are other types of grand solar minima that are much more severe because they last twice as long, about 150 years. The last of these severe solar minima was the Sporer minimum, which occurred in the 15th and 16th centuries. There have been only 4 such Sporer-type grand minima in the entire Holocene. 2,800 years ago, there was the Homer minimum. 5,200 years ago, the Sumerian minimum. And 10,300 years ago, the Boreal minimum. We know when they occurred thanks to tree rings. If the dates sound familiar, it is because the 4 grand Sporer types Holocene minima coincide exactly with the 4 major climatic events on the graph we saw earlier. We know that during each of these grand solar minima, when the Sun's activity dropped for 150 years, the climate experienced a tremendous cooling that had a major effect on climate proxies around the globe. We also know that low solar activity during the grand minima has had a major impact on human populations. Past human settlements and their component structures can be radiocarbon dated. When humans were doing well in the past, the population grew and they built more, and when they were doing poorly, usually because there was less food, the population decreased and they built less. Scientists have estimated the evolution of the human population of the British Isles by analyzing the radiocarbon dates of thousands and thousands of remains from hundreds of archaeological excavations. What they have found is that the population increased greatly with the advent of agriculture, but every time there was a severe deterioration in the climate, the human population suffered from diminishing resources. And the largest declines occurred when grand sporer-type solar minima took place. Other population declines also coincide with other cooling periods, confirming our reconstruction. This tells us that the worst climate changes in the past have been caused by changes in solar activity. It also tells us that what is bad for humanity is cooling, not warming. Now we can respond to the IPCC and NASA. Never mind that solar irradiance changes very little, and never mind that temperature does not always do the same thing as solar activity. Clearly, there are other factors at play, but we can state emphatically that changes in solar activity affect the climate because that is what the climate says. The study of past climate leaves no room for doubt. The sun changes the climate, and if we don't know how it does it, we should study it. Since low solar activity causes cooling, it stands to reason that high activity must cause warming. Solar activity in the 20th century was very high, in the top 10% of the last 11,000 years. If we count the number of sunspots in each solar cycle over the last 300 years and divide by the length of each cycle, we can see how much solar activity has deviated from the average. Since the Maunder minimum during the Little Ice Age, solar activity has been increasing and was well above average between 1933 and 1996, a period of 6 cycles of increased solar activity that formed the 20th century solar maximum. Although we cannot know how much of the 20th century warming is due to this modern solar maximum, there is no denying that it is a significant part, because, as we have seen, the sun has been the cause of much of the major climate change over the past 11,000 years. There are two pieces of good news in this study that I bring. The first is that solar activity cannot rise above the 20th century maximum. It is not like CO2, which can keep going up. The sun's activity can stay high or go down, but it cannot go up, so the warming will not accelerate and will not be dangerous. In 2016, I developed a model to predict solar activity in the 21st century. At the time, some scientists believed that solar activity would continue to decline until a new grand solar minimum and mini ice age. But my model predicts that solar activity in the 21st century will be similar to that of the 20th century. It also predicted that the current solar cycle, the 25th, would have more activity than the previous one, and it was right. The second piece of good news is that if much of the 20th century warming is due to the sun, then there is no climate emergency. Believing that all climate change is due to our emissions is one of those errors that sometimes occur in science, like believing that the Earth is the center of the solar system, that interplanetary space is full of ether, or that stomach ulcers are caused by stress, not bacteria. The effect of the sun on climate has been debated for 200 years. The basic problem is that when we study the past, we observe strong climatic changes associated with prolonged periods of low solar activity. But when we observe the present, we are able to detect only small effects due to the 11-year solar cycle. There are several possible explanations for this discrepancy, but the main question is how the sun affects climate. In its fifth assessment report, the IPCC used climate models to calculate the sun's contribution to warming. These models only take into account changes in the total energy coming from the sun, which is known to vary by only 0.1%. Therefore, the IPCC's answer is that the sun has contributed nothing to the warming. This is absurd given our knowledge of past climate and the fact that we have just passed through a 70-year solar maximum, one of the most active periods of solar activity in thousands of years. Scientists who believe this are ignoring a large body of evidence that the sun affects climate in ways that cannot be explained by these energy changes alone. We have time to review only a few of these unexplained effects. Let's start with the surface. Most of the sun's energy reaches the surface of the planet. If this energy increases by 0.1%, then every point on the surface receives 0.1% more. One would expect this to cause a small overall warming, estimated by scientists to be 0.02 of a degree Celsius, which is undetectable. But that is not what is being observed. Several studies show that the surface is warming 4 times more than it should, 0.1 degrees Celsius. And it is doing so in an extremely irregular way, going from a solar minimum to a solar maximum. Some areas show more than 1 degree Celsius of warming, while others show more than half a degree of cooling. This is not the effect you would expect. If we analyze the average for each latitude, we observe a very strong warming around 60 degrees north latitude. But if we analyze the change at 20 km altitude in the stratosphere, we observe something very curious. The response in this layer of the atmosphere is a mirror image of the response at the surface. Why is this important? The IPCC tells us that one of the fingerprints of warming due to our emissions is that we see warming at the surface and cooling in the stratosphere. But if the sun also shows an inverse response between the two, then the observation is no longer evidence of guilt. It could be the sun. It is also important to note that the part of the globe that has warmed the most during global warming is the land surface of the northern hemisphere, precisely the part that shows the greatest warming in response to a more active sun, while the tropics have barely warmed at all. Changes in response to solar activity are also observed in the ocean. Years ago, some scientists studied the rates of warming and cooling in the upper layer of the tropical oceans. They found that it follows a cycle similar to that of the sun. However, there is a problem. The variation in the sun's energy is 10 times smaller than it would need to be to cause these changes. Instead of thinking that this supports an indirect effect of the sun on climate, the rest of the scientists ignore the study. But if the sun controls the temperature of the upper layer of the tropical oceans, one would expect the solar cycle to have an effect on the El Niño phenomenon. In the Pacific, trade winds push warm surface water westward, bringing up deep cold water of the coast of South America. This is called the neutral phase. In some years, the trade winds become stronger and push the cold water toward the center of the Pacific, accumulating more warm water to the west. This is the La Niña phase. In other years, the trade winds blow more slowly or in the opposite direction. The cold water stops rising in the east, and the water in the central and eastern Pacific warms. This is the El Niño phase. This oscillation affects the weather of much of the planet, and we must remember that it has 3 states, not 2. Since 1990, there have been countless studies on the solar cycle and El Niño. They have all been ignored. You will not find any reference to them in review articles, books, or IPCC reports. I set out to investigate this relationship using solar activity data and the Oceanic El Niño Index, which shows in blue the periods when the equatorial Pacific is cooler than average, and in red when it is warmer. Since solar cycles have different lengths, I divided both data series into segments of a solar cycle and then adjusted the length to be the same for all cycles. This statistical technique is called epoch analysis. In this way, the mean and variance of the data are determined for periods that coincide in their phase of the cycle. This revealed a pattern that indicated an El Niño response to solar activity. I looked at a period when the cycle is gaining activity, which is accompanied by La Niña conditions. I used the Monte Carlo method to determine the probability that this result was random, and the answer was only 0.7%. This means that there is a 99.3% chance that the La Niña conditions at this time in the solar cycle are due to the sun. Since the answer is clearer for La Niña, I analyzed the relative frequencies of each phase of the El Niño phenomenon. What is observed is that the neutral condition years follow the solar cycle in their frequency with a delay of 1 or 2 years. Surprisingly, the frequency of La Niña is the opposite of neutral. The solar activity determines whether it is a La Niña year or a neutral year. The sun's effect on El Niño years is less clear. El Niño seems to have another cause, which could be the amount of heat accumulated in the ocean. The solar pattern is confirmed by a study of El Niño frequencies since 1900, because among the repeating peaks, there is an 11-year peak, which is the frequency of the solar cycle. It is striking that with so much evidence and studies, the vast majority of scientists do not know or do not want to know that the sun controls the very important El Niño phenomenon. But El Niño is a product of the action of the trade winds over the equatorial Pacific. To control El Niño, the sun must control the atmospheric circulation. We have known since 1988 that the sun affects atmospheric circulation, but like other effects of the sun on climate, most scientists reject this knowledge. This effect on the atmosphere may affect hurricanes in a much more significant way than global warming. The graph of the annual number of major hurricanes in the world is inverted and shows that as solar activity decreases, the number of hurricanes increases. How does the sun manage to affect the atmosphere? In 1959, a scientist discovered that changes in the polar vortex seem to respond to solar activity. This is a question that continues to be studied, and we are beginning to understand that much of the effect of solar activity on atmospheric circulation is due to this effect. In this graph, I will show you the solar activity in red, cycle by cycle. In purple, at the bottom, you can see the strength of the polar vortex using data from this study. High values indicate a strong vortex, and low values indicate a weak vortex. These values tend to show a large change from year to year. In blue, you can see the cumulative wind speed that forms the polar vortex. The data is from this study. When the curve goes up, it indicates that most of the time the speed is above average and the vortex is strong. When it goes down, it indicates the opposite. During cycle 20 of low solar activity, the vortex wind was slower than normal, and most years had a weak vortex. This corresponds to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when many winters were cold. Then came cycle 21, which was very active. The wind speed increased, and there was only a weak vortex at the beginning and end of the cycle, when solar activity was low. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the winters were warmer. Cycle 22 remained very active, and the wind continued to be faster than normal, resulting in no weak vortex years. Winters continued to be warm throughout the 1990s. With cycle 23, solar activity decreased again, leading to a decrease in wind speed. Weak vortex years returned, and also, since the late 1990s, cold winters have returned, something that scientists who ignore the sun's effect on climate have trouble explaining. The data I have does not cover solar cycles 24 and 25, but the correlation between low solar activity and cold winter continues, especially in eastern North America and Eurasia. Since the late 1990s, winters have tended to be colder across much of the northern hemisphere, while the Arctic has warmed, as this figure from a study shows. The winter of 2024 was the coldest in Mongolia in decades. 6 million animals died, 10% of their population. Without understanding the effect of the sun on the climate, this cannot be understood. None of this has anything to do with CO2, and when solar activity becomes high again, these trends will reverse. But to admit that the sun controls the temperature of northern hemisphere winters is to admit that it has contributed to the observed warming, since much of the warming is due to increasing northern hemisphere minimum temperatures. The sun's effect on the atmosphere also have a striking effect on the Earth's rotation. Since the middle of the 20th century, we have been able to measure the speed of the Earth's rotation with great precision. In 1962, a French scientist realized that solar activity modified the rotation speed of the planet. Since then, this finding has been confirmed by dozens of studies, and no one has been able to prove that it is not true. Climatologists are not aware of this finding, and if they were, almost no one will be interested in it, because it implies accepting that the sun affects the climate in some unknown way, because this phenomenon cannot be explained by a small change in solar energy that the IPCC accepts and the models incorporate. I have also analyzed the data, and they leave no room for doubt. The Earth's rotation increases twice a year when winter arrives in each hemisphere. I chose to analyze the changes that occur between November and January because the change is smaller and more variable, allowing me to see the response better. This graph compares a high solar activity year with a low activity year. When activity is low, the rotation speeds up and each revolution is shortened by half a millisecond. My analysis confirms what many researchers have found. The Earth's rotation changes with solar activity. When solar activity is low, the rotation accelerates more between November and January, and when it is high, it hardly accelerates at all. The effect is disturbed by other phenomena that also affect the rotation of the planet, such as El Niño, but the 11-year cycle is clear. The result obtained in other studies with a different treatment of the data is similar. The effect of the Sun on the rotation has been known for 60 years, and yet no explanation has been given. Its cause must necessarily lie in changes in the angular momentum of the atmosphere. The exchange of angular momentum between the Earth and the atmosphere can be understood in terms of what happens to an ice skater when he turns. As the arms move away from the body, the spin becomes slower, and as they move closer, the spin becomes faster. The problem is that changes in angular momentum large enough to affect the Earth's rotation cannot be caused by changes as small as 0.1% in the energy deposited at the surface by the Sun. This is why we know that the IPCC is wrong if they only consider this increase. None of what you have just seen is reflected in the IPCC reports, which completely ignore the large amount of evidence showing that the Sun's effect on climate is not limited to a small change in energy, and none of this is in the climate models, which are very incomplete and do not reproduce how the climate really works. And there is more evidence that I have not told you about. To recapitulate, we have seen that the changes caused by the Sun on the surface have inverse dynamic patterns to those of the stratosphere. We have seen that it causes temperature changes in the ocean far greater than they should be, and that it controls El Niño, the major global climate phenomenon. We have seen that it regulates the strength of the polar vortex, which affects the frequency of very cold winters in much of the northern hemisphere. And we have seen that it alters the rotation of the planet. None of this can be explained by a 0.1 change in the energy reaching the planet's surface from the Sun. There is something else, something that has been studied since 1987 that can explain these effects. The IPCC knows about it and mentions it in its 5th report, but is unwilling or unable to understand its global significance. I will tell you about it. It can be argued that the effects of solar activity on climate that we have analyzed are temporary and will soon be reversed. The activity varies cyclically every 11 years. El Niño gives way to La Niña. The vortex changes its strength every winter, and the rotation of the planet returns to what it was. However, there are two things that tell us that there is a much stronger long-term effect, and therefore that solar activity has a cumulative effect on climate that we do not yet understand well. One is that, as we have seen, the winter temperature trends in the northern hemisphere change over decades with solar activity, causing a warming in the Arctic and a cooling in North America and Eurasia during the winter since the late 1990s, which has been going on for 25 years now because of the low solar activity that we have had in the 21st century. The other is that, as we saw earlier, low activity for more than a century in the past was the cause of some of the major climate changes of the Holocene. I have spent the last 10 years trying to understand how climate changes naturally, without preconceived ideas, by examining a huge amount of information and data. The evidence has led me to an alternative theory of climate change to that of the IPCC. It is not based on changes in solar activity, but to my surprise, it explains them. There is much more to climate than the Sun, but the conclusion is that the 20th century solar maximum has been a major contributor to recent warming, and it is not lost on me that this means that controlling our emissions, which has become the main goal of the UN and the Western world, may not have much effect on future climate. The IPCC does not accept the evidence we have reviewed. It is a political organization advised by scientists chosen at the suggestion of governments who decide what to include and what not to include in the reports. None of the evidence for the Sun's effect on climate is included. The role of the IPCC is to assess the risk of human-induced climate change, not to find the causes of climate change, which since its inception has been assumed to be due to our emissions. But a few scientists, often attacked and obstructed, continue to try to explain the sun's effect on climate, and have developed three different explanations. These three theories are not mutually exclusive. The fact that one is true does not mean that the others are false. The first theory is based on the direct effect on climate of changes in solar radiation. Because the effect is proportional to the cause, we say it is linear. This theory has been defended by Dr. Sun, Professor Scafetta, and 35 other scientists in a recent paper. To explain the sun's effect on climate, these scientists make their own temperature reconstruction based on rural stations to avoid the urban heat effect, and their own reconstruction of solar activity over the last 2 centuries. The graph on the left shows the reconstruction compared to the one accepted by the IPCC on the right. The difference between the two would explain a much larger effect of the sun on climate than that accepted by the IPCC. In the second theory, it is cosmic rays that change the climate, and the sun's magnetic field regulates the amount of cosmic rays that reach the Earth. It is therefore an indirect effect, but also a linear one, since the change in cosmic rays would be proportional to the activity of the sun. This theory, proposed by Dr. Svensmark, is based on the fact that cosmic rays create ions in the atmosphere that act as cloud seeds. Part of the theory has been confirmed by experiments in a particle accelerator, but it is not yet known whether the effect is significant enough. One problem is that cosmic rays have increased while satellites show a decrease in the low cloud layer, which may actually contribute to the observed warming. The third theory is the one I have proposed. In it, the sun is not indispensable to natural climate change. There is a poorly understood climate process that is affected by the sun, but also by several other factors. Change in this process causes changes in the climate. The sun acts indirectly on the climate, and its effect is non-linear because other factors are involved. Non-linear means that the effect is not proportional to the cause. This explains why there is no direct correlation between the sun and surface temperatures, nor should there be, although the sun's effect is important. What is this process capable of changing the climate in a natural way that scientists have not properly accounted for? It is heat transport. What is heat transport? Most of the sun's energy reaches the Earth in the tropics, creating a zone of excess energy that receives more energy than it emits, shown in red in the figure. Outside the tropics, there are two energy deficit zones, which receive less energy than they emit and whose size depends on the seasons. They are shown in blue in the figure, which presents the situation during winter in the northern hemisphere. These imbalances should result in continuous warming in the red zone and continuous cooling in the blue zones. That this does not happen is due to the transport of heat, which also transports moisture and clouds, and is very important for the climate. The climate of any region depends on insolation and the transport of heat and moisture. But heat transport is a gap in our knowledge of the climate. There are several reasons for this. The first is that it responds to very complicated physics, and as the scientists who study themselves of knowledge, we do not have satisfactory theories to describe it. In addition, we cannot adequately measure it because it is constantly occurring in the atmosphere and in the oceans, and it varies greatly throughout the year. From satellites, a global calculation of heat transport is made, but we cannot distinguish the variations in what is transported by the atmosphere and what is transported by the ocean. The seasonal variation is very important because of the tilt of the planet's axis. Much more heat is transported in the winter than in the summer, and some of that heat goes in and out of the ocean without being adequately measured. Because we know almost nothing about heat transport, the models do not know it either, and although they can be made to reproduce the total annual amount transported, they are not able to do so in the same way as the climate. Despite this lack of knowledge, most scientists believe that variations in heat transport have not contributed to recent climate change. Why do they believe that given their lack of knowledge? The first reason is that when heat is transported horizontally within the climate system, the amount of heat contained in the system is not changed, and that heat continues to produce the same infrared emissions to space. Therefore, heat transport cannot cause global climate change, only regional changes. Is this true? Actually, it is not. It is rarely mentioned, but 75% of the Earth's greenhouse effect is due to water vapor and water clouds, and their distribution by latitude is extremely uneven. The tropical atmosphere contains a lot of water, and the polar atmosphere in winter contains almost none. Therefore, the greenhouse effect in the polar regions is extremely small, and the transport of heat from the tropics to the Arctic changes the emissions. This means that the total is not constant, so heat transport has the ability to change the global climate. If the total amount of heat transported were always the same, the transport would not cause climate change, and this is what many scientists believe. They believe that as heat transport through the atmosphere increases, heat transport through the ocean decreases, compensating for the change, and the total amount does not change. This theoretical compensation, which has never been proven, appears differently in each model without knowing its physical basis. This means that for these scientists and models, transport is not a cause of climate change. But again, reality is different. Heat transport can increase in the atmosphere and also in the ocean, changing the amount of energy transported. In fact, this is logical because most ocean transport is in surface currents driven by wind, which is also responsible for heat transport through the atmosphere. If the wind increases, the transport in both compartments must increase. This is also supported by data from two studies of Arctic heat transport in recent decades. Both atmospheric and oceanic heat transport increased in the early 21st century. According to theory and models, this is not possible, and yet the effects of this increased heat transport could not be clearer. In the Arctic, winter temperatures have risen sharply. Obviously, that heat has to be transported there because the sun does not shine in the Arctic in winter, so no heat is generated. And the increase in temperature has greatly increased the emission of infrared radiation into space. Remember that the greenhouse effect is very weak in the Arctic at this time of the year, and heat is not retained. Because of the warming of the Arctic caused by increased transport, the planet is losing more energy than it was losing before. So what has caused this warming of the Arctic in the 21st century? Scientists say it was the increase in CO2, but that is not possible. CO2 has been rising sharply since the 1950s, and its effects on radiation are instantaneous. They do not take 50 years. There's also talk of it being a consequence of the warming that's been going on since the mid-1970s, but that's not possible either. Why should it take 2 decades for the heat to reach the Arctic? We have the sun. Arctic warming and increased outgoing radiation coincide in time with the decline in solar activity that began in the mid-1990s with solar cycle 23, which, as we have seen, was accompanied by the weakening of the polar vortex. How do we know that the change in solar activity caused the change in transport and the warming of the Arctic? Because it has been doing so for thousands of years. This study by leading scientists looked at the relationship between solar activity and Greenland's temperature and found that over the past 4,000 years, solar activity has been inversely correlated with Greenland's temperature. When solar activity decreased, Greenland warmed, as it is doing now. It also says that there have been periods in those 4,000 years when Greenland was warmer than it is now, which is inconsistent with being caused by our emissions. How can solar activity cause changes in heat transport? The signal from the sun is received in the stratospheric ozone layer, which absorbs much of the ultraviolet radiation. This is a very sensitive receiver, because UV radiation changes 30 times more than total radiation, 3%. But in addition, the increase in UV radiation creates more ozone, which also increases by 3%. With more ozone and more UV radiation, the ozone layer experiences a temperature increase of 1 degree Celsius with solar activity, which is much more than at the surface. The ozone response to changes in solar activity modifies the temperature and pressure gradients, and this causes the speed of the zonal winds in the stratosphere to change, as we saw earlier. In the figure, these winds are shown as circles, and the stronger the winds, the more circles there are, and the darker their color. When the activity is high, the gradients become larger, and this causes the wind speed to increase, and when the activity is low, the gradients become smaller and the wind speed decreases. In the troposphere, atmospheric waves called planetary waves are generated, and when the wind is weak, they reach the stratosphere and hit the polar vortex, weakening it. But when the wind is strong, they do not manage to enter the stratosphere, and the vortex remains strong. Changes in the vortex are transmitted to the troposphere, altering atmospheric circulation and heat transport. Planetary waves are atmospheric waves of the Rossby type. They are like ocean waves in 3 dimensions, and of gigantic size. The largest storms on the planet fit into their undulations and have a huge impact on meteorology. They are responsible for some of the most extreme atmospheric phenomena, such as the heat waves in Europe in 2003 and in Russia in 2010, and the floods in Pakistan in 2010, in China in 2012, and in Europe in 2013. The amount of energy they move is staggering. Planetary waves are the largest of all, and under certain conditions can reach the stratosphere, hitting the polar vortex and weakening it. 50 years ago, a scientist suggested that if the sun had an effect on climate, planetary waves were a possible candidate for the mechanism, but no one investigated this possibility and the paper was forgotten. A 2011 study finally proved him right, showing that planetary waves in the northern hemisphere respond to the solar cycle. The graph shows the sunspot cycle in red and the amplitude of the planetary waves in black. We observe large oscillations from one year to another because the mechanism is not exclusive to the sun, and there are other causes that affect it. This is the difficulty of studying nonlinear phenomena. But the effect of the solar cycle is clear because the highest amplitudes occur in periods of low solar activity. The effect this has on the polar vortex was seen earlier in this graph. More active solar cycles with fewer planetary waves have faster zonal winds and stronger vortices, while during less active solar cycles, the increase in planetary waves weakens the vortex. We have already mentioned the effect this has on the frequency of cold winters in the northern hemisphere. But how does this mechanism explain the change in global climate? My theory is that when solar activity is high, the zonal winds are strengthened, preventing the planetary waves from entering the stratosphere and allowing the vortex to remain strong throughout the winter. By acting as a wall, the vortex reduces heat transport to the Arctic in winter, and this causes temperatures to drop, reducing the infrared emissions to space that allow heat to escape from the Earth. All of these steps have been verified by scientists. The result is that by reducing emissions, the planet conserves more energy, which can cause it to get warmer. This is the situation that occurred from the mid-1970s to the late 1990s, when the planet experienced strong warming under high solar activity. When solar activity is low, the zonal winds subside, allowing planetary waves to enter the stratosphere and hit the vortex, weakening it. As the wall weakens, heat transport to the Arctic increases, causing it to warm. This warming increases emissions to space, causing the planet to conserve less energy. The result is that the planet either warms more slowly or cools, depending on other factors. Because this mechanism regulates the amount of heat that enters the Arctic in winter, I have named my theory the Winter Gatekeeper. It is important to note that this is not a solar theory, although it does explain the sun's effect on climate. Variations in heat transport are a general cause of climate change, perhaps the most important. Any factor that persistently changes the amount of heat transported becomes a cause of climate change, and this includes plate tectonics and orbital variations. This theory has the ability to explain the ice age of the last 34 million years and the growth and shrinkage of the ice age in glaciations and interglacials. The explanations it provides fit the evidence better than the CO2 changes. The solar mechanism I propose has the following features. It is indirect because what changes the climate is not the change in solar energy, but the change in heat transport. It is exclusively due to changes in the sun's ultraviolet radiation. It produces dynamic changes in the stratosphere, which is the part of the climate system whose response to the sun is important for climate change. The mechanism works by altering the propagation of planetary waves, as proposed 50 years ago. Since there are multiple causes that affect this propagation, the cause-effect relationship becomes nonlinear, which makes it very difficult to study because we humans think linearly. It affects the polar vortex, which is responsible for transmitting what happens in the stratosphere to the troposphere, determining the position of the jet streams and the atmospheric circulation in winter. In its final part, the mechanism alters the transport of heat to the Arctic in winter. This is the most visible effect of the sun on climate. Winter temperatures in the Arctic and the frequency of cold winters in eastern North America and Eurasia reveal the sun's effect on climate. Finally, the mechanism works because the greenhouse effect is extremely heterogeneous across the planet. It is a very thick blanket in the tropics, leaving the poles exposed. Increasing CO2 doesn't change that, because most of the greenhouse effect is due to water, which changes much more than CO2. This theory explains many of the problems that the sun's effect on climate has always had. It explains the mismatch between the small change in solar energy and the resulting climate effect. The change in solar energy only provides the signal, like the finger pushing the button on an elevator. The energy to change the climate is provided by planetary waves, which carry very large amounts of energy and act on sensitive parts of the climate. It explains the lack of cause and effect correlation claimed by NASA and the IPCC. It is a nonlinear process that cannot be required to have a linear correlation. It explains the recent warming of the Arctic, the timing of which cannot be explained by CO2 or global warming. It explains the recent increase in cold winters in the Northern Hemisphere that scientists cannot adequately explain. It explains changes in the Earth's rotation due to the Sun that no one has been able to explain. Changes in atmospheric circulation induced by the Sun are what alter the angular momentum responsible for variations in the Earth's rotation. It explains the cumulative effect of changes in solar activity on climate, why grand solar minimums have such a large effect proportional to their duration. Low activity alters the energy balance by increasing emissions throughout the duration of the grand minimum, progressively reducing the energy of the climate system and causing the effects to become larger and more global over time. It explains the greater impact of solar-induced climate change on the Northern Hemisphere, as it affects the heat transport to the Arctic. The Antarctic polar vortex is much stronger and less sensitive to solar forcing. This is why the medieval warm period and the Little Ice Age caused by solar forcing were much more pronounced in the Northern Hemisphere. It also explains a significant part of the 20th century warming. The 70 years of grand solar maximum in that century caused the planet to increase its energy and warm up. The sun has a lot to say about future climate, but we are not listening. Long-term changes in solar activity are cyclical, and what adds to warming now will subtract from it in the future. This theory does not deny that changes in CO2 affect climate, and indeed it is based on differences in emission due to changes in the greenhouse effect, just not in time but in space, with latitude. But it is undeniable that if the sun has played a relevant role in the warming of the 20th century, it reduces the role our emissions have played. The climate emergency is not so, and waiting until we are sure is the most prudent thing to do, because predictions that ignore such an important factor will fail, and the enormous cost incurred will not be recovered.
Okay, so is there any sort of a short elevator pitch type of thing that you could say to kind of sum up in just a small number of words what your theory proposes?
Yes, my theory is actually a thermodynamic theory of climate change. It explains that natural climate change occurs through a mechanism that by altering the transport of heat from the equator towards the poles, and this alters the energy content of the planet because it affects infrared radiations due to the very extremely low greenhouse effect at the poles because of the lack of water vapor in the atmosphere, since water vapor is the main greenhouse gas. And the sun appears to affect climate through this mechanism.
So recently, I've seen some data, I think, from Joe Bastardi about relatively warm temperatures in the Arctic in winter. But by your theory, that is the Earth losing heat, right? Heat is transported up there and then it's being lost to space?
Yes, that's right. I mean, this is something that is very clear because the Arctic in winter has no source of heat. The sun is not shining. So when we see Arctic warming during the winter, that's heat that is being transported from lower latitudes. And since in winter, the atmosphere of the Arctic is so transparent to infrared radiation due to its low greenhouse effect, then we get a very effective loss of energy to space from the Arctic.
Okay, and do I understand you correctly that in times in the deep past, maybe there might have been 150-year periods with low solar activity, and so for that whole time, the heat is being lost through the Arctic for that whole 150-year period?
Yes, that's correct. We know from solar activity in the past, from radiocarbon data, and even from sunspot records, that there are periods, very long periods of decades and even centuries, where when solar activity is very low for most of the time, and the result that this has, according to my theory, is that more energy is lost from the planet through those periods, and this causes general cooling that affects primarily to the northern hemisphere, and then later, if the cooling is prolonged enough, it will affect the entire planet, causing important, major, abrupt climate changes from the past.
And also, if I understood you correctly, it looks to you that throughout the remainder of the 21st century, that solar activity is not going to be dramatically lower or higher than it has been recently?
Yes, well, this is coming from statistical data on when and where this solar grand minimum of the past have been taking place. And I developed a model that basically incorporates different frequencies of this solar activity through the Holocene. And when it is projected to the 21st century, it shows that we are going to have, in general terms, relatively high solar activity for about 50 or 60 years during this century.
And do I understand you correctly also that if the CO2 levels on Earth might go to, let's say, 800 parts per million, that by your theory, that wouldn't make a great difference in the temperature of the Earth because the heat would still be lost up in the Arctic and the additional CO2 wouldn't have that big of an effect?
Yes, according to my theory, what we have is that the planet is basically protected from climate change by the greenhouse effect due mainly to the role of water vapor, and the three states of water really basically make the climate quite stable in general. But this has a quite weak spot in the Arctic. So if the planet gets very warm, it will ventilate heat to space by moving it to the Arctic. And basically, this is quite regulated. So CO2 in general does not appear to have much effect on climate. We cannot say how much effect it has, but if we analyze the past, what we see is that through most of the last 50 million years, and even through the last 10,000 years during the Holocene, we don't see that the changes in temperature correlate well with changes in CO2. So I would say it doesn't look like CO2 has much effect on climate.
All right. And before this, you and I both looked at what ChatGPT said about the Winter Gatekeeper theory. And surprisingly, it was pretty good, wasn't it?
Yes, I was very surprised because, all these artificial intelligence things sometimes give nasty surprises because they get things completely wrong. And this is a new theory that is pretty much ignored so far by climate scientists. So it seems that GPT has managed to get the information correctly.
And then I think you say in your video that your theory does not mean that other solar theories are incorrect, right? It might be very complicated and then cosmic rays may have an effect and et cetera.
Yes, climate is so complicated that this idea that this very, very complex scientific question can be answered simply just by saying, for example, it's just CO2, this cannot be correct. Very complex questions rarely have very simple answers. So I cannot say that my theory is the only one that shows how the sun affects the climate. And I cannot say about other phenomena affecting climate. What we have to do is to study all of them and then try to find out which one is more important and which one has more effect.
All right. And who else is working with you? Or Andy May, it sounds like, has worked with you on this theory, or anyone else?
Well, pretty much I developed the theory on my own, and then Andy May helped me a lot in disseminating it, in presenting it to others. But no, I'm not working with anybody. I'm just alone.
All right. Very good. Any other points you'd like to make before we wrap this one up?
Yes, if you don't mind, I would like to share a couple of slides. Okay, so the thing is that prior to the 1960s, there were many theories about what could cause climate change. And there were people discussing plate tectonics and other causes that could change the climate. But since the 1960s, when climate models were developed, it all came to a single principle, a single paradigm, in which it is the change in the energy flux at the top of the atmosphere, what is called the Earth's energy imbalance, that changes the climate. So the thing is that right now, basically all the theories are based on competing for this single principle. So we have the CO2 hypothesis says the outgoing radiation has decreased because of the increase in CO2, and that's what why the planet has warmed. While the theories that try to explain global warming through a solar change in general, they try to say that the incoming energy from the sun has increased, and that is why the planet has warmed. And the cosmic rays theories and the clouds theories say that what we are seeing is a reduction in the reflected solar energy at the top of the atmosphere. So the planet will have warmed because more energy from the sun is retained. And my theory comes from a completely different principle, because my theory, as it's shown here in blue, would be the amount of water vapor in the atmosphere. So basically what we have is a planet that is completely protected from climate change by this greenhouse effect. But what would change climate would be through changes in the amount of heat that is transported to the poles in winter and is lost there by infrared radiation. So it will be a completely different paradigm. And the advantage is that this does not compete with the IPCC theory. But if this theory is true and is important, it reduces the importance of the IPCC theory, the CO2 theory. And basically, it's just not about the sun, because my theory can explain most of the climate changes through the past 50 million years due to tectonic changes that have changed the transport of heat towards the poles.
Let's see, I need to understand a little better that how much of this effect is North Pole versus South Pole currently?
All right. So the thing is that the polar vortex is absolutely essential for this theory. And the polar vortex is very strong in the southern hemisphere. So we know that for a fact. It has been measured, and sudden stratospheric warming, which is something that happens sometimes in the polar vortex, is a lot more frequent in the northern hemisphere. And this is because most of the continents are located in the northern hemisphere, and because most of the large mountain ranges are located in the northern hemisphere. So this produces these planetary waves that weaken the polar vortex. So as a result, the Arctic polar vortex is much weaker and then is subject to modulation by all these factors. So the sun affects a lot more the northern hemisphere polar vortex, the Arctic vortex, because it's much weaker. And although it should have a similar effect, since the Antarctic vortex is so strong, it doesn't change much.
Excellent. Do we have good measurements of how much heat is being lost each year from the Arctic, or do we need better ways to measure that?
We need better measurements. We already have some data on emissions from NOAA satellites about emissions between 60 degrees north and 90 degrees north, but they are not very good because these satellites do not have polar orbits. So they don't go above the poles, and they don't really measure well the very high latitudes. I think this is changing. They just launched a satellite that has a polar orbit that is designed precisely to measure emissions from the Arctic. So I think that over the next few years, we should be able to obtain better data. But the data that we have now does support my hypothesis.
So given what you know now, do you think it is possible that the climate sensitivity to doubled CO2 is less than 1 degree centigrade?
I would say clearly yes. I mean, I have looked to this in the past, and there is a very interesting period that I just saw in this slide, which is the Oligocene. And this period that started about 34 million years ago and was it showed basically a very, very strong decrease in CO2. The CO2 went from about 700 ppm to about 350 ppm, so about less than half in a few million years. And at the same time, the planet was warming. You know, after Antarctica froze, the planet went through a cold period, and then it started to warm towards the mid-Miocene climate optimum. So it warmed for about 10 million years, while CO2 was decreasing strongly. So I don't think CO2 has a very big effect on climate. So I don't think doubling our CO2 levels would be in any way catastrophic or anything like that.
Do you have any specific advice for people who really want to dig into your work and maybe read your book, Solving the Climate Puzzle? Any advice on specifically how they should start? Like, I think you said that there's different pieces that they could read about the different pieces at first, something like that.
Yes, well, what I tried to do was to expose my hypothesis and the evidence supporting it. So this made for a slightly complicated book. So people who have an inclination for science will probably be able to enjoy it a little bit more. But I wanted at the same time to make it accessible to anybody. So what I did was to establish a different reading levels. So this is explained in the introduction of the book. And you can start looking at some figures. Then it has like abstracts at the beginning and conclusions at the end of every chapter and every section, which are written in a more simple and accessible language. So people can move into the book progressively and then reach the deeper levels where more complex things are explained.
All right, very good. Any other things, any other points you'd like to make?
No, I cannot think of anything at this moment.
Okay, yeah, I'm a huge fan of what you've done, both your written work and your videos. I think it's fantastic. So thanks for everything you're doing.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Talk to you next time. Bye.